So hi everyone, welcome to our Technology and Project Delivery webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Technology seems to be growing by leaps and bounds in the AEC industry these days. Existing technologies continue to evolve, such as CAD and BIM, while newer technologies and processes are being introduced, such as robotics and generative design. With so much change happening, it can be challenging to keep track of it all. In today's discussion, you'll learn which technologies are changing the way we design, build, and operate from the first-hand perspectives of our panelists, Evan Gear from Brown and Caldwell and Robert Manna from Stantec. Before I hand the floor over to Unified's resident strategic solutions lead to get today's discussion started, I want to quickly encourage our audience to use the Q&A tool in their Zoom windows to ask questions as they come to mind throughout today's discussion. We will get to these at the end of the webinar in the order that they are received. Without further ado, I'll hand the floor over to Jay to kick things off. Jay, take it away.
All right, thanks, Laura. All right, so we do have a pretty broad topic that we're discussing today, and I say that because, technology and project delivery, they really involve almost every aspect of our businesses. That can include communication, project management, file sharing, the list goes on. But with that being said, what we're going to do today is just talk to these two folks from our industry who've experienced new and or improved technologies and the effect that those technologies have had on how we design and construct buildings and ultimately how we handle them during occupancy. So before we jump into that discussion, let's go ahead and start with some introductions. We'll start with Evan. So being at Brown and Caldwell, what do you guys do? And more specifically, what do you do as the manager of design automation?
Thanks for that intro, Jay. Brown and Caldwell, we're an environmental engineering firm, consultants as well. Our space is focused in design and in particular in the environmental sector. My group, the design automation team, we focus in trying to do that cheaper, faster, and better. How can we get our design product out the door more timely, cost our clients less money, but either maintain or even better yet, increase the quality of those deliverables. So I've got a team of developers, implementation, and support that help drive those initiatives forward.
That's great. And so as the manager of design automation, for those listeners that may not be as exposed to it, how would you define design automation in our industry?
Sure, yeah. I mean, just that, really leveraging technology to push the envelope in terms of saving our clients money, reducing the time to get product out the door, and increasing quality. There's so much out there today to latch on to, looking at, be it workflow or people or even the technology tools out there. How can we tie all of that stuff together to really improve our performance and delivery?
That's awesome. Yeah, and
sorry, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah, and we'll definitely dive into more detail there as we progress through the discussion. So thank you for that. And then Robert, so tell us more about Stantec, what you guys specialize in, and what you do at your firm. Robert? You guys hear Robert? Because I'm not hearing. Oh, yes, I hear you now, Robert. Yep.
Sorry about that. We had a technology mishap. Happens. Stantec, 22,000 people globally focused on delivering design services. So Stantec doesn't really do construction. We're focused on designing just about anything you could think of, from high-rise residential healthcare to dams, water treatment facilities, and everything else in between. So I usually tell people I'm part of a 5,000 person architectural engineering firm focused on the delivery of building design. And I've got 18,000 of my closest friends or so that do a whole lot of other stuff around the world. So I think that's the short and sweet story.
Sure, yeah. And then so I noticed that you've been at Stantec for a while, and it seems like you started as a BIM specialist of some sort, and then you moved through the ranks as a designer, and now as an associate. Can you just elaborate on that path a little bit?
Sure. Yes. So yeah, trained as an architect originally, did the whole architecture thing for a number of years, and moved more and more into helping it manage technology, implement technology services. So grew up, cut my teeth on Revit, but now really responsible or part of a team of about 12 people that are responsible for our buildings group, use and implementation of technology to drive our designs. So in particular, I have a portfolio of stuff around support management, custom software development, rolling out sort of large infrastructure pieces. So the adoption of BIM 360, for example, the use of Unify, management of Unify, and data analysis, and all sorts of other fun stuff in between to fill in the gaps. So again, it's great having a large team to help manage all the aspects of this technology, really from delivery, so working and using Revit, to the business side, things like Nuforma, filing email, project archival, et cetera. We sort of own all of that as our team does.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. So thank you both for joining us. It sounds like we've got the right folks on the line here to talk about technology in our industry. And, as I mentioned earlier, it is sort of a broad topic. So the way I would like to structure the conversation is try to break it up between the major phases of project delivery. So we'll talk about design, and then construction, and then eventually operation or post-occupancy. And then again, realizing that we do have folks on the line that are design-centric, I think, or more specific to the design side. So as we move into the construction conversation, we can talk about things like construction administration, which is where the design team is usually engaged during construction. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start talking about which technologies are changing the way we design buildings. And we've all been in the industry for some time now. There have definitely been some significant changes in the past several years of late. Our industry is sort of notorious for adopting technologies at a slower pace than others, or maybe we're just a little behind. But obviously, we're seeing some huge advancements in the more recent years. So just to kick it off here, what are some technological advancements that you guys have witnessed on the design side in recent years? We can talk about things like going from CAD to BIM, or this new focus on data. So Evan, what are some new advancements that you've witnessed in recent years?
I think focus on data is really the big one for us in our industry. We're a little bit backwards from the traditional vertical building design, being in the environmental space. We're really looking at, water and wastewater treatment plants being our bread and butter. So at the end of the day, we're focused on things like our equipment, the data behind the equipment, what makes those things tick, how can we achieve our process outcomes. So the data is really the center, the driving force of our design, more so than things like, what's the building going to look like, or what are we trying to achieve in terms of building requirements. Oftentimes, we may not even be building a building. So for us, that move towards focusing on the data at the center, trying to interconnect all the different technologies that we use to drive our designs, things from, hydraulic analysis to feeding that into our Revit models to, validate, verify all the lengths and whatever spatial requirements, bring that back into the hydraulic modeling, et cetera. It's really trying to get data at the center and let the data drive the design.
That's great. That sounds like a critical piece to any sort of automation as well, right? Because automation is essentially either creating data or using data to some extent. It's no longer a human manually doing any sort of input. Yeah. I'm sure there is some level of that.
Absolutely. I think for me, if we're doing our job right, someone should only enter in one data input once. If we're tagging a pump as PMP 101 in Revit, in our schematic drawings and PNID or wherever else that tag shows up, someone better be syncing that from a centralized data source or some sort of central data model, or we're not really implementing BIM fully and correctly.
Right, definitely. And Robert, what about at Stantec? What's your focus like on the data side of what we're doing here?
We certainly push to use data quite a bit. Our engineering teams obviously continue to use data is at the heart of what they do as engineers. So we continue to work with them closely to adopt tools that allow them to better manage and better leverage that data, right? So going back to my earlier comment a little bit about, we've evolved some or we continue to evolve some. It's really focused on how do we get people to move away from traditional approaches to adopting new tools or using tools in a consistent way. So that's a big issue for us is with so many people spread so widely across North America and the globe, how do we deliver a set of tools that really allow them to use data consistently so that they can work with each other? Because a big part of what Stantec likes to promote is that we collaborate and work together across our offices and organizations. So that means we have to have standardized approaches to the data, because otherwise it's like speaking different languages, right?
Absolutely.
The other big place where we see data adoption oftentimes driven by the client either directly or indirectly would of course be healthcare. I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that healthcare projects impose a huge amount of data requirements on projects to ensure that we're ultimately delivering what's required, and really getting into the issues of, is that modeled? Does it need to be modeled? How are we accounting for it if it's not in the model, right? The joke used to be, oh, it's in the model. Well, what if it doesn't belong in the model? How do we still know that we've got it? Are we accounting for that in some way with another tool in parallel with our modeling tools, so that again, we're not over modeling, but we're still accounting for everything that we need, and we can generate the kind of reports and outputs that our clients are looking for.
Yeah, right. And that actually brings up an interesting topic as well, is sort of when we were moving from CAD to BIM. And, today our deliverables are still drawings, essentially. I mean, there will be some requirement to some extent of the models, but I know a lot of design firms that still, they have that sort of the statement, the kind of the release of liability, if you will. The model, everything that's contractual is based on the drawings. Are you guys seeing that as well on your end, where it's still, the model is sort of, I want to say the drawings again are the contract documents. So the models being sort of supplementary, but again, not necessarily contractual. Are you guys still seeing that on your end?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
BC, we're seeing that. One of our larger projects, 4,000 drawings, the original requirement was wet signatures. It was a collaboration project with across 50 offices and 20 different design firms, and they wanted wet signatures on 4,000 drawings. So we had to change that just for sheer sake of shipping that many drawings across the country. But even that was a struggle, and I think for a lot of our clients, that's the reality. Is we talked earlier about slow uptake of technology in our industry. I think a lot of our clients being so risk averse or so bogged down with regulatory requirements that it makes it difficult to, not just get technology uptake, but also change some policy to make progress.
Yep. And Robert, what about on your end? Probably just a similar story.
Yeah, I'm apologize for the technology problems today. I apparently have an unstable internet connection. So that's the way it goes some days. So yeah, I think we're still on the question of the change in deliverables. Ultimately, we haven't seen a huge change in deliverables, right? We are still seeing a lot of clients that expect a set of documents. I mean, it's maybe PDFs instead of printed documents, but ultimately I don't really distinguish very much between a PDF versus something printed on a piece of paper. And also the authorities having jurisdiction still expect a set of drawings. There's a very limited number of authorities, particularly within North America, right at this point, that are going to accept some sort of model as a deliverable. So particularly within the building space, we still see a lot of demand and requirements for drawings, and BIM or a model or data are oftentimes supplementary conditions that owner or a client may ask for. If they ask for those types of things up front, we're usually in a very good position to accommodate them and work with our client or owner to make sure that we're delivering something that meets their needs and expectations. At the same time, we've certainly seen it where owners or clients, come to us at the 8th or 9th hours to say, "Oh yeah, we want a model." And it's kind of like, "Oh well, we're very happy for you. We didn't build a model to meet your needs. So
Right.
we will provide a model, and we'll attach the various disclaimers to that model to state that we built a model for our purposes because there had been no express intent or expectation conveyed to us that there should be a model or a data set provided for some other purposes." And so we're generally quite happy to share our stuff with people, but within the expectation of, well, we did it for what we needed to accomplish our goals. We didn't necessarily build a model with the expectation of a contractor taking ownership of it or making use of it, or a client taking ownership or making use of that model. Again, unless that's sort of something that we negotiate up front or somewhere in the process. So we're it is what it is. And we're happy to meet clients' needs or requirements as long as they tell us about them in advance.
Right. Yeah, and that totally makes sense because your focus on the design side really, again, are the drawings today, anyways. But if you were to have a 100% accurate model from a data perspective, it would require, I'd imagine, such an extravagant way of validating that data, right? Like, how do you get your entire management team or executive team to validate that data when they might not have the proper tools or training as well? Or even from the owner side, they might not even know how to consume that data, right? Or which standard to ask for.
Yep.
So that's definitely an interesting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some folks that are in the same industry as Evan as well. And I know that they've had some clients that have sort of asked for the moon in very generic terms and contracts. And we have internal discussions about, well, how do we price that? And the answer is, well, do your regular pricing and multiply by 4. And maybe we've got enough money in there to accommodate very undefined requirement.
Yeah.
Give us something to sink our
the
teeth
multiplier.
Yeah.
Well, Robert brings up a really interesting point that, I think what's happening for a lot of our clients, and I've seen this a couple of times on a couple of different projects, is they're implementing their BIM and data standards as we're doing our design projects. So maybe the requirement off the bat is either pretty nil or pretty abstract of, hey, we know we need something, but we don't know what that is yet. And that puts us in a really challenging situation, especially on a larger project. You want to meet the client's needs and desires and set them up for success. But at the same time, they're evolving with the technology as well.
Definitely, yes. And, I have been on projects where the BIM execution plan was more or less a, quote, living document, which I think is a little scary sometimes, because if they start implementing new requirements within that document while the project is in progress, you guys can imagine, as you mentioned, Robert, the impact to cost and labor and things of that nature. So what about like artificial intelligence, machine learning? I know, Evan, you have a computer science background, and Robert, you had mentioned that you have essentially a team of developers that create custom tools. Have you guys been experimenting with any of that type of technology on your end?
I'll jump in. We haven't been experimenting yet, but the way that I see the world, my lens through this is, coming back to that data focus, is once the technology is ready, once we feel like we've got enough standards in place to implement it, what I want is when we get to that point to have enough consistent, well-structured data to feed the AI and machine learning algorithms so that they can better understand how at Brown and Caldwell we do design work. If all of our data is different, every single project kind of does something a little bit different here, a little different there, we're not setting ourselves up well for that future of of AI and machine learning really being applied. So we're not there yet in terms of implementation, but we're definitely thinking about it and trying to set ourselves up right for the future.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And Robert, what about you guys?
Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm still.
Yeah, there's a little bit of feedback, just so you're aware.
Yeah, is that better?
There's an echo coming in, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm getting echo too.
I think, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
No more echo.
Nope.
All right. Sorry. So I really apologize. I've never had this many issues with a webinar.
Because you got technology experts on the line. It means all the technology has to break.
Yeah, seriously. So where were we, Jay? Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, we were talking about implementation or I guess research and development on AI and machine learning.
Yeah, so it's something that I think a lot of people are interested in. It's certainly something we're interested in as well. In my personal opinion, based on, I've been involved in a number of discussions around AI and machine learning in the last 2 years. It's it's harder than we would like to think. And that, and I think there's some challenges there in terms of particularly within the AE space, because with both AI and machine learning, you really need a really large data set to properly teach the AI, right? And have it learn, or have the machine learning learn what it is you're wanting to accomplish. And so I think, firms like Stantec and BNC, we oftentimes probably have enough data to teach AIs and machine learning algorithms, but the question is, can we really wrap our hands around that data in a meaningful way to be able to engage with developers of those technologies? So I think there still remains some big challenges. I think there's some huge opportunity with AI and machine learning around some of the more, shall we say, boring tasks related to architecture, engineering, construction. So, text recognition and image recognition are really well developed across those technologies. So there's, I think, a lot of opportunity in things like managing RFI and submittal processes, right? That there's huge opportunity there, because you just have to do text recognition to be like, oh, hey, this RFI or this submittal should go to this person, right? Because I scanned all the text and I just know from reading it who probably should review this particular document for this particular project team because of their role on the project, something like that. If we want to talk about AI and machine learning for the purposes of straight up design, I think, again, that's where the challenge is, getting the data set and sort of finding the right niche place to apply those technologies within that process. Is it trying to do some sort of document review to ensure that we're producing a good set of documents based on just sheet layout? Is there opportunity to sort of teach an AI how to recognize good sheet layout versus bad sheet layout? Not to say that it's going to be able to tell you if the detail is any good, but just like, yes, this looks, based on previous history, this looks like a decent set of documents that are well organized and navigable. So yeah, I think that's a broad, open field and topic for which it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, particularly within our little space of the world as opposed to other industries.
Yeah, and it actually reminded me of an idea that I had, going back to your comment earlier about the authorities having jurisdiction and them not necessarily adopting a model-driven process of permitting or approving drawings. I'd always thought that with AI and machine learning, maybe there's a way for us to use all of the permit drawings as a data set where we could teach AI how to read a drawing. Not necessarily just going back to the layout of a sheet, but even like reading a schedule, for example, and then converting that into some sort of a data set. And then the city being able to then take that knowledge that the AI has and being able to then process data from a BIM model and approve a model that way for permit. But yeah, just a random idea that I had.
And I think the other challenge too with artificial intelligence and machine learning is the whole, there's been at least 3 or 4 magazine articles at this point, or newspaper articles at this point, where the headline was something along the lines of, robots are going to take your job, or AI is going to take your job. And fundamentally that is a real concern. And we certainly have seen and will continue to see some displacement in the workforce because of those technologies. But I think, particularly for those of us who are involved in the process of design, there's certainly a fear and almost sort of I don't want to say loathing, but sort of like, a computer can't replace me, right? I'm a designer, and maybe that's more an architecture attitude more than anything, or an architect attitude more than anything. Like, well, I can do something that the computer never can or never will be able to do. Because I whatever you want to say, I've got a soul, I've got a heart, whatever. And so, how do you moderate that, and what is the right answer? And I'm as an architect, or having an architecture background, I should say. I think there's a place for artificial intelligence and machine learning to augment our practices, augment the processes of design, but ultimately too, there needs to be that human intuition or that human involvement to either make the final decision, or determine that this is the path we need to go down, and leverage the computer to help determine which path to take, and maybe to help determine what are the most optimal choices, right? As opposed to the computer's going to solve it all for us, which seems highly unlikely. One thing that I foresee happening is, as we do see adoption of various tools like Dynamo, and you've got Refinery now, which is basically optioneering on top of Dynamo, that again, the computer might be able to generate 1,000 or 10,000 options that are somehow scored. Unless a client is specifically telling us to show them that many options, ultimately we still only want to present the client 2, 3 options, maybe. They're hiring us for a reason, right? If we could just push a button, they wouldn't hire us. So these tools can help generate lots of options, but still it comes back to the architect, the designer, to again make some informed decisions, because we probably actually can't constrain everything as much as it needs to be constrained, at least within building design. This is a huge issue where, again, you look at some of the tools that are out there, in particular Refinery. If you're not limited in the number of constraints you can add. Well, you were, maybe I think they've expanded it, but if you start to put in lots and lots of constraints, it becomes really hard to understand and evaluate the options, because there are just so many constraints that then the scoring metrics become really hard to manage and ultimately analyze to say, well, this is the right option. So you're always better off with fewer constraints, and then making that informed decision as an experienced architect or designer to say, well, these 3 seem to have the most possibility, particularly when I think about all these other things, all these other issues that we didn't sort of put into the solver that generated all these options for us. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. Anything to add to that, Evan? I don't want to cut you off there.
No. I think a lot of what Robert's saying rings true. I think particularly getting back to that large data set, getting okay, we've got a ton of data, but is it the right data? Is it organized well enough? Is it something that an AI machine learning type algorithm can even digest? If we've got, in our world, everything starts with the schematics, but a lot of our specialty equipment, there aren't industry standards for what symbols you use for certain things. So you've got inconsistencies there, because you've got client standards, BC standards, maybe some other weird stuff going on. So there's a lot of things like that present real world challenges to really leveraging AI. But if we can, on the back end, standardize our data sets, make sure that, okay, this symbol looks like this here and looks like that there, but on the back end, the classification is still the same, then we can leverage that data in the future to really feed the machine. One thing I wanted to add, though, is kind of tying together the 2 topics, back to the people side of things, is the collaboration side. As information workers, I think there, different research studies show that we waste a ton of time just looking for the right information. I think this is a place where AI and machine learning are already starting to help us out, leveraging tools like Microsoft's suite to, you're doing this sort of thing, you're working on that, you're talking to this person, hey, maybe you're interested in this information. That stuff's already out there and being leveraged. And I think oftentimes we take that level of collaboration for granted, of really putting the information people need in front of them when they need it, when they're looking for it. That's a real, present day opportunity to leverage some of these tools and technologies that are out there.
Right. And, on that note, with thinking about the, new forms of deliverables, maybe the technology is actually affecting some of, maybe adding new formats for what clients are looking for. Have you guys seen anything in terms of requirements for VR or AR? Maybe for Robert being more on the architectural side. But what's your exposure been to that technology?
Yeah, we have clients that are more and more educated. I'm not aware yet of any projects that it's sort of been a contractual requirement that there's an expectation we deliver an AR or VR experience of any type, but we certainly increasingly see clients who are educated in one way or another. Either another design firm has introduced them to that technology, or they're just knowledgeable about it in the first place for one reason or another. And so it is particularly, I would say, VR, and maybe not so much VR, but the easy sharing of 360 images, and or maybe a VR, a virtual experience along the lines of a game engine, though maybe not a full game engine kind of thing, but that there is increasingly an expectation of that level of sophistication of like, well, yeah, you should be able to just send me this image that I can walk through, or maybe not an expectation, but they're not surprised either, which means if they're not surprised, that means the next step will be an expectation of, well, why aren't you delivering this to me? Or where's the walkthrough image that and that I can just run with my Xbox game controller, and whether you have a headset or not is a little bit immaterial, right? Because you can render it either way, and some people don't like headsets. But the technology is getting to the point where that it's just going to be like other technologies previously. It just becomes a part of the workflow. If you're not doing it, you're behind. And I think we're quickly getting there. Again, not so much in that it's stated as a requirement, a literal requirement in a contractual document, but just that, well, yeah, firm XYZ did this, why aren't you?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of that, of what Robert said there, that, I think the client's expectations are increasing more so than their requirements. One of the places where we can really leverage a lot of the, if not VR, but just a 3D fly through, is engaging the plant operators in the design process. These are people who, typically aren't trained to read contract documents. They're not experts. They don't really see the problem until it gets built. But by leveraging 3D, letting them fly through the model, or even getting them into a VR headset, they can identify these issues that their staff engineering team is not going to see because they're not maintaining these things on the day-to-day.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been helpful for us, getting that earlier feedback in the design process. The other component where we see AR and VR playing out is on the AR side. A lot of these water and wastewater treatment plants are critical infrastructure. And there's a lot of, don't turn this valve off, or if you turn this valve off, make sure this pump's not running, whatever. You can create a lot of issues if you don't follow the right operating procedures when just operating the plant. So the place where AR can really help us out, we've implemented this on several projects, is embedding QR codes or some sort of way to get the operator out into the field with an iPad or an AR headset and scan the device and understand how to service it, how to maintain it, turn it on, turn it off, what are the requirements around it, what flow is going through that at the current moment, get that information into their hands right when they're out there in the field, rather than having them have to call back to the office, or perhaps even walk back there to get that data. So we've got a handful of projects where we're playing owner's advisor, helping to implement standards with the client. partnering with them to figure out how to implement this across all of their design projects for an overhaul.
Well,
Yeah.
that's interesting. Oh, sorry, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to jump on top of Evan's comments there because, you know, particularly again in the water and wastewater treatment area, not only are they critical infrastructure, oftentimes it's existing infrastructure as well that we're being asked to modify. So again, I do happen to know that Stantec's done some work in the same area as well, where these are existing plants, in some cases bordering on 100 years old, depending on what part of the world you're in. And we're being asked to implement changes and basically do, you know, surgical alterations to these existing facilities. And augmented reality has been hugely helpful in those situations for some of our groups, where they've done exactly what Evan described, but not so much in terms of plant operations, but being able to demonstrate to those same folks, the guys who are actually running the facility, here's where the new valve is going to be. Here's where the new pipes are going to run. And yes, it's going to fit along with all the existing infrastructure that you've already got. And that's hugely important as well, in addition to just making sure you can operate it safely and efficiently and not screw everything up, because that's kind of bad. People like clean water for some reason.
Yeah, the metaphor I like to use is doing a, you know, wastewater treatment plant upgrade is like trying to replace a heavily used bridge across a, you know, busy river crossing or something, but not being able to close down the bridge or put in a bypass. You got to keep the cars going over it while you rebuild the thing from scratch. And so it's a real challenge in terms of, you know, just like Robert's saying, getting the information around what can we turn off when, how can we sequence, and you know, how can we sequence out the construction and demolition and maybe put in some temporary infrastructure to make things work, because you can't turn off a wastewater treatment plant.
Sure. And then on the topic of existing work, or, you know, tenant improvements or renovations to existing work, I mean, are you guys using a lot in terms of laser scanning and point clouds as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. We rely on that heavily. Like Robert was saying, a lot of these projects, a lot of these plants are upwards of 100 years old. And, you know, even if the drawings are accurate, you look at California, San Jose wastewater treatment plant is right there on the bay. It's on bay mud. And things like the pipe tunnel housing all the pipes has moved 3 feet. So it's not even where it was in the drawings anymore. So absolutely, you know, if we're not relying on laser scans to get accurate information about what's in the tunnels, we're not going to do an accurate design.
And I think on the building side, you know, we leverage laser scans where appropriate. Again, I feel like when you're more on the process and plant side, particularly with these large projects, the design firms are more aggressive in capturing that information ourselves, or we're in a contractual arrangement where it's in the interest of the whole. It's a joint venture, basically, where it's in the interest of the whole joint venture to capture that data and be aggressive about making sure you've got that. I think on the building side, it's a little less so, right? Because frankly, it's a little less critical in a lot of situations. So where we think it warrants it, we will certainly capture that data ourselves. But more often than not, it may be a contractor also getting involved early, who, as the surveyor and ultimately the person who's responsible for building the facility out, may choose to laser scan it, and then, you know, we sort of benefit from that choice of the contractor if they're involved early, or if they've got a client that's knowledgeable enough. But certainly if we get into a scenario like a historic renovation or having to integrate with a historic building of some nature, then, you know, we might pursue that, or we would even recommend that to the client, say, hey, we really should get this scanned and work that into the budget in some way, shape, or form. But again, I think that's a good example of where, depending on your client type, that's something that they're going to be aware of and thinking about, and probably even promoting it some themselves. And other clients, it's not something they really think about until we bring it to the table and say, oh yeah, by the way, have you considered getting this laser scanned? Because we think it would be really beneficial to the success of the project. So.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something actually that Evan had touched on earlier about data standards. I'm just curious about, in terms of these new types of deliverables that might be required with data standards. Maybe I'll start with you, Evan. You had mentioned, managing multiple models as a single data set, previously in a different conversation that we had. Is that something where, well, first of all, you can tell us a little bit more about that, how you're doing that internally, but also is it something that you're delivering to the client in any way, maybe like as a Kobe deliverable or FM ready data? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, those are great questions. So it is a rare design project where we only have one Revit model. And generally, we're not even starting in Revit. We're starting in something like AutoCAD PNID or some other process and instrumentation diagram, some sort of schematic modeling program. So at a minimum, we've got 3 or 4 or 5 models that we're trying to coordinate all the data across. And then you include your specs and your schedules and all of the hydraulic modeling, all of the engineering analysis. Turns out the same data point, the same pump is going to show up maybe 30 different places, even in a small project, because the electrical team has got to plug that into their single line diagrams. Instrumentation and control team needs to plug that into their process and instrumentation diagrams. And then we've got to show where that thing exists in space. The structural team has to know about it to put concrete pads down, whatever. So getting that data consistency and getting that data collaboration is really the critical component of driving quality and efficiency in our design work. One of our larger projects, we've got about 100 Revit models. We're collaborating with, I think, 20 different consulting firms. A lot of our clients have local business enterprise or smaller business requirements where you have a really big contract. These big engineering firms are going to win that contract, but you're required to engage with the community. So that means is not only we're trying to coordinate models within our own firm, we've got to reach outside our doors and make sure that we're leveraging some sort of tool or tool set that can allow collaboration outside of our firewall, outside of our doors, and sometimes even collaboration in real time with the client. That, of course, adds a lot of additional challenge. You have to have a really solid BIM execution plan. You really have to make sure that your standards are well understood in advance, where you can get misalignment of data.
Sure, and that's, yeah. And Robert, I think that you had mentioned something about the new ISO standard as well, which is an industry-wide standard as opposed to an internal or project-specific standard. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure.
ISO 19650. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for looking up the numbers, since I never remember numbers.
Yep.
So yeah, we've recently started to take a hard look at the new ISO standard, which for those of you on the call who may not know is based on the PAS 1192 standard that was developed in the UK for their BIM level 2 implementation requirements. And effectively, ISO lifted that whole UK standard and interpreted it into the new ISO standard, even keeping the Queen's English for those of us in North America who are like, what? What's an appointee? But the interesting implications of ISO, from what we've seen so far, and anybody familiar with PAS 1192 will probably come to a similar conclusion, is that the whole first half of it is geared towards the assumption that you have a client coming to you with a specific data requirement that they've been able to spell out. Like, here is the information that I need delivered. And in this case, data, it would include geometry as well as, the type marks for all the different pumps in the building and whatever else that you've got. In our experience, there are not very many clients who are that organized, particularly within the framework of buildings. And so we don't see a lot of clients coming to us with those kind of robust requirements. We do have some in certain sectors and certain industries. Oftentimes they're particularly organized around certain aspects with facilities management and wanting to track some specific data points. But the by and large, most don't. You get the other sort of set of clients that come to you and ask again for the moon. It's like, okay, well, what do you actually want or need? Strangely enough, when we start asking questions, those requirements seem to just sort of go away and never to be seen or heard of again. And so what we find is, that's the first half of the ISO standard. If you look at the second half of the ISO standard, it's really all about delivery. And we think there's a lot of opportunity for design firms, including Stantec, to be able to say, yes, we are ISO compliant insofar as if a client comes to us and is sort of meeting their requirements from the ISO standard in terms of being able to say, here's what I need, here's what I want, that our work processes, our documented work processes, documented best practices will in fact be compliant with those recommended practices that come out of ISO, which is really what ISO is all about. A lot of it's common sense in our opinion, sort of like, yeah, why wouldn't you do that when you're delivering a project? But fortunately, sometimes these things need to be written down so that you can measure it effectively, right? So that's where we're at. Again, we don't see a lot of client demand. Maybe one of these days we'll see an uptick in client demand, but I'm not holding my breath either.
Yeah, we've got a slightly different perspective on the handoff on the industrial side. Is this design data is going to be going into the client's computerized maintenance management systems. And a lot of these guys have legacy hardware from 20, 30 years ago, or some of them are just upgrading and just implementing this stuff. So it kind of comes back to that. Sometimes we're in an amorphous BIM execution plan, and sometimes even an amorphous data standard. But the more we can adhere to industry standards like ISO, the more we can structure that data in a way that's going to be easily transmitted to the client, maybe then translated into their system. But most of our, I'd say, probably not most of our clients, most of our sophisticated clients, larger clients, are looking for some sort of data transfer at the end of the project, if not to them directly as the design, then to the contractor, and then the contractor is responsible for completing that information and delivering it to their computerized maintenance management system. And that eventually is what's going to become that online O&M manual, their operations and maintenance manual, and that's what's going to feed those AR tablets and QR codes out in the field that the operator is looking at. So it's really all interconnected for us, where managing that data really well up front, letting that drive the design, having good centralized data across all of our touch points between models and firms and whoever, getting all of that stuff centralized and consistent really sets us up well to deliver that data to the client.
Yeah, and actually, Evan, you bring up a really good point there, and it's something I've thought about in the past on how really the design phase of the project, it's where the data is actually generated most of the time, right? Like the design teams are creating data essentially out of thin air, and then by having that sort of standardized, you can then pass it on to the contractor or the owner, and having it be predictable and structured in a way that they know how to consume it, I think is sort of where the industry is moving towards. But I don't think we're quite there yet. But I think everyone sees the value in it. It's just sort of where, how do we get there? I guess how do we get to a point where people can actually read our data easily without going through complex mining or even using AI to translate or map data. So with that being said, actually, we're coming up to the end of the hour here, but I wanted to make sure we make some time for these other sort of pieces of the conversation. I know we've sort of talked a little bit about construction and the owner side and occupancy, but let's just try to touch on how technologies are changing the way we construct buildings. And again, since most of you guys, and myself included, come from the design side, maybe we can talk about just construction administration and how technology has helped and improved with that phase of the project. We can start with something like cloud collaboration tools, right? So there's like BIM 360, as Robert mentioned. Even I know a lot of workflows revolving around things like Bluebeam and markups. Again, going back to the drawings being contractual. What have you guys seen as far as new technologies during the construction administration phase of a project?
I'll jump in here too. Having these roles as owner or advisor, we actually do get to play a part of the construction process. From the construction administration side, like you're saying, we've got clients who are doing massive overhauls to their treatment plant, completely redefining their treatment process. This plant that's however many years old. So these projects end up getting broken up over a program into many projects. And for SAC Regional, we're working, that's in Sacramento, we're working as the owner's advisor, leveraging 4D, 5D, and embedding that into the model, doing construction sequencing, cost estimating, helping the client figure out when they need to, how they need to generate funds and when they need to generate funds to pay for what's going to happen, but then also identify scheduling conflicts and construction sequencing conflicts between the different projects. So project A is behind, how does it affect the other 50 projects that are going on at the same time? Or does it? And we were able to identify issues up front and early and put in corrective actions to save the client a ton of money.
Right, and is that based on, would you say, BIM data, or are there other tools that you guys are using to kind of, help out with the 4D, 5D, even 6D?
And for me, it's all BIM data, right? BIM's just centralizing the data in the middle and embedding that into your 3D model or 4D model or whatever. So we're leveraging Revit, Synchro, and Primavera, Assemble to pull that stuff together and then put together animations and show the client what that stuff looks like.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I've used Synchro a little in the past, and I was pretty impressed with how you can tie specific Revit elements to construction activities. I'm assuming you guys are using Synchro in a similar manner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're tying the construction sequencing, the phasing to an actual element. So it could be cut and fill. It could be putting a piece of equipment in a new concrete pour. One of the things we identified on our project was we were going to put the roof on a concrete pit, basically, before we put the equipment in there, and the equipment was too big to get in any other way. The only way to get that equipment in would be before you finish pouring the concrete. We were able to identify that sort of issue up front because we've got it baked into the Revit model. We can see, okay, you got to actually get the equipment in before you pour the roof.
Sounds like that could have turned into a pretty expensive mistake there, or a miss, I should say, on the coordination scheduling side.
Let's demo the roof and rebuild it.
Yeah. And Robert, anything on that level where it's maybe your data or models are being used for estimates or scheduling? What's your experience been there?
So again, if I look at the building side of the equation, we certainly have some projects where that comes into play. If we're involved in like a P3 project where we're working for the developer / builder, oftentimes there's an expectation to share our models to help with those efforts, but it's not really our direct responsibility. But at the same time, we get projects that really benefit more from the advancements in mobile technology and new technologies coming onto the scene, like PlanGrid, or older technologies continue to enhance themselves, like Nuforma is continuing to add mobile applications and things like that to make it easier to access and leverage that data that you've already got stored in that centralized system. Those are the types of tools that ultimately have a lot of benefit for our end users, Bluebeam Studio sessions, things like that, because ultimately, again, we're the designers, and we need to work with the contractors, share data back and forth, and we any tool that makes it more seamless to move that data back and forth is going to be adopted fairly readily. And going back to a comment Evan made earlier about, if you start to have a scope of, 20, 50 offices of your own company, and maybe also sub-consultants and consultants involved spread across a large geographical region, that's where particularly these new tools like BIM 360 and Revisto, et cetera, really start to, the teams are more readily adopt those tools because they recognize there's no other way they're going to get their job done at the end of the day, except to adopt tools like that. Whereas the office that I call home continues to do a lot of work here locally in the Boston market. And ultimately, there's not a lot of demand to see a major shift in traditional workflows because there's not a lot of recognized benefit when you can be out on the site in 15 or 20 minutes if you need to be, right? A contractor calls you up and says, hey, I need you to stop by this afternoon. can you stop by? Sure, not a big deal. We need to have a meeting. Great, we're all here. We'll have a meeting. We'll talk about it. We'll look at something on the screen, and we'll make some decisions. So it's interesting to see those differences play out based on project type, project scope, team scope, who the owner is, who the client is, et cetera. All really ultimately play a role in what technologies get adopted and for what reasons and for what benefit.
Sure, and actually, I have one other question on the construction contractor side, and it's sort of related to what we're talking about here as well. What about IPD, integrated project delivery, and have you guys had any exposure with sharing models and collaborating on a model, I guess a live model with the contractor? So maybe it's an IPD project where you're using a Revit cloud model and you're both in the same model. Have you guys been exposed to that workflow?
Yeah,
on projects?
We've quote unquote done IPD projects before. That was even before BIM 360, so that had its own set of challenges. I don't, there's, in my experience, there's very few examples of 100% true IPD, right? There's lots of examples of working fairly closely with contractors in some way, shape, or form, whether that's 100% shared scope, as in we're all in the same model, or more likely divvying up the scope in a way that makes sense, where the contractor's got a model that represents the thing that's most of interest to them or their subtrade, and we have a model that's likely representative of the things that we're most interested in as architects and engineers. There's a lot of ways you can split it up, right? We've worked very closely with curtain wall consultants on projects in the past and even projects today, where they're providing a model and we're basically telling them, hey, we need to move this, because we want to change the design or whatever the case may be. So there's, it varies quite a bit. I think, IBD was a great idea in theory, 10 years ago when we all talked about how we'd all be delivering these IBD projects and shared risk reward models. And, I haven't seen a huge adoption rate of those, but I have seen adoption and changes to workflows for sure. It could be something as simple as just giving the contractor access to the Revit models that are in BIM 360 so they can download them and chop them up and do whatever they need to do to get their job done. And they can go and get those models with relative ease, right? And again, knowing what the constraints are around how those models might be used. And there are certainly high profile projects like the Lucas Museum of Narrative Arts, where it's a organic design. It's highly complex. It's a client that has very high expectations, is very comfortable with technology as well. And we've got to work closely with the contractors and the builders and the subtrades to make sure we can actually build that building. So, but it's not an IBD project, but we're still collaborating very closely with the folks who are actually building it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll kind of bring it back to bring the same question back to the data. Is the IPD versus traditional design work for us has very different data requirements. Typically in our design world, we're only be doing level of development 300. For construction, it's more like 500, right? We're not going to be picking a make and model. We're going to have recommended manufacturers or equivalent, whereas the contractor will have that equipment picked out. So the level of detail is very different, and the level of detail in the data that we're collecting and managing is very different. That changes how we need to set up all of our tools in our collaboration set.
Right, that makes sense. And I just want to quickly thank you guys for joining us today on the webinar. We are here 1 minute left, so I do want to hand it back over to Laura to give us our outro. But again, thanks guys. That was a highly insightful conversation. So Laura, I'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, gentlemen, for that wonderful discussion. And thank you so much to our audience for attending today. Very informative, but it looks like we're to the end of the hour here. I did keep track of all of the questions that came in via form submission or throughout this webinar. We will have Jay, our strategic solutions lead, answer those, and we will send those out to you individually after the webinar.
And I do want to quickly remind the architects and engineers who joined us today that by attending this webinar, you have earned continuing education credit. So for the architects, we will be sending out a quiz and opportunity for you to provide feedback shortly, and you are required to complete this in order to get your continuing education credit from AIA. Thank you once again, everyone, so much for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to having you at our next webinar. Have a wonderful day. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.